There is a philosopher whose name you almost certainly know, whose quotes appear on the walls of gyms, in the bios of LinkedIn profiles, in the mouths of people trying to justify behavior that has nothing to do with philosophy. His most famous concept, the will to power, has been used to justify domination, aggression, and political violence. It has been tattooed on arms by people who have never read a word he wrote. It has been weaponized by ideologies he would have despised with every fiber of his being. And underneath all of that noise, underneath the misquotations and the misappropriations and the century of deliberate distortion, there is an idea that is genuinely one of the most useful things philosophy has ever produced. An idea about what human beings are actually capable of, about why most of us are living smaller than we know we can, about what it would mean to take your own life seriously as a project of growth and self-creation. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. And tonight we are going to talk about what he actually said and what it means for how you actually live. Before we get to the idea itself, we need to spend a few minutes with the man. Not because biography is the point, it is not, but because understanding who Nietzsche actually was dissolves several myths that get in the way of understanding what he was trying to say. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Prussia. His father was a Lutheran pastor who died when Friedrich was 5 years old. He was a brilliant student, so brilliant that he was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel at the age of 24, before he had even completed his doctorate. The university simply gave him the degree on the basis of his published work and gave him the chair. He was also, for most of his adult life, in significant physical pain. Migraines so severe they could incapacitate him for days. Vision problems serious enough that reading and writing, the activities his entire existence depended upon, were frequently agonizing. Digestive illness that made ordinary life genuinely difficult. This matters because everything Nietzsche wrote about the will to power, about self-overcoming, about the drive toward growth and excellence despite suffering. He wrote it while suffering. His philosophy was not theoretical. It was lived. The man who told you to embrace your struggle and make something from it was doing exactly that every single day at a desk where reading hurt his eyes and the light hurt his head. In January of 1889, Nietzsche collapsed in Turin. He never recovered his sanity. His remaining 11 years were spent in a state of mental incapacitation, first in a psychiatric institution, then in the care of his family. And here is where the story of his ideas takes a turn that explains almost everything about why they are so consistently misunderstood. His sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, took control of his unpublished manuscripts and his literary estate. Elisabeth was a fervent German nationalist and anti-Semite. These were positions that Nietzsche had explicitly and repeatedly attacked in his writing during his lifetime. He had described anti-Semitism as a form of the slave morality he despised above all else. He had broken with his close friend Richard Wagner, partly over Wagner's nationalism. He had written letters to Elisabeth herself, expressing fury at her political beliefs. None of this stopped her. With her brother unable to object, Elisabeth edited his private notebooks, selectively arranged his unpublished fragments, and created a book she titled The Will to Power, a book that Nietzsche never wrote, assembled in an order he never chose, framed to support a worldview he had spent his career opposing. She cultivated relationships with the rising Nazi movement. She eventually met Hitler personally. The image of Nietzsche as the philosopher of German racial supremacy, an image that persisted for decades and still clings to his name in certain corners of the internet, was constructed almost entirely by his sister from his grave, using words he wrote for entirely different purposes. Post-war scholars spent decades untangling the real Nietzsche from Elizabeth's fabrication. The work is largely done now. Serious philosophy departments have no confusion about what he actually believed. But the popular misconception runs deep, and it means that when most people encounter the phrase will to power for the first time, they encounter it already contaminated. So let us clean it up. The will to power, as Nietzsche actually conceived it in his actual published work, has almost nothing to do with power in the way the word is normally used. It has nothing to do with dominating other people, nothing to do with strength over weakness, conquest over submission, the powerful over the powerless. Those interpretations would have made him furious. They represent exactly the kind of crude, unreflective thinking he spent his career attacking. What the will to power actually describes is something far more interior, far more personal, and far more demanding than simply being stronger than the person next to you. It is the fundamental drive in all living things toward self-overcoming. Not the overcoming of others, the overcoming of yourself. Nietzsche believed that the deepest impulse in human life, underneath every other motivation, every apparent desire for comfort or safety or approval, was the drive to grow. To become more fully what you are capable of being, to push against the boundaries of your current self and expand beyond them. This drive, he argued, is what makes us alive in any meaningful sense. When it is expressed, when we are genuinely growing, genuinely creating, genuinely pushing ourselves towards something we cannot yet do, we experience what he understood as vitality. When it is suppressed, when we choose comfort over growth, safety over challenge, the familiar over the demanding, something in us withers. We may not be able to name it, but we feel it. That feeling is the will to power telling you something important. The phrase self-overcoming sounds abstract. It sounds like the kind of thing that belongs in a philosophy lecture rather than in a conversation about how you actually live your life. So let us make it concrete, because Nietzsche was not writing for academics. He was writing for people, and the thing he was trying to describe is something every person who has ever pushed themselves past a point they thought was their limit has already experienced. They just did not have a name for it. Think about the last time you did something genuinely difficult. Not difficult in the sense of complicated or time-consuming. Difficult in the sense of requiring you to overcome something in yourself. Fear, resistance, the part of you that wanted to stop, to retreat, to choose the easier path that was available right there beside the harder one. Maybe it was a conversation you had been avoiding for months because you knew it would be uncomfortable. Maybe it was a creative project you finally started after years of telling yourself you were not ready. Maybe it was a physical challenge you did not believe you could complete until you did. Maybe it was simply choosing on a morning when you had every excuse available to you to do the thing you said you were going to do. Whatever it was, on the other side of it, there was a feeling, not just relief, something more than relief, a particular quality of aliveness, of having expanded slightly beyond the person you were before you did the hard thing. That is what Nietzsche was pointing at. That is the will to power expressing itself. And his argument, the argument that runs through everything he wrote, is that this is not an occasional experience to be sought out for its own sake. It is the fundamental orientation toward life that makes a human existence genuinely lived rather than merely endured. He was particularly interested in what happens in the absence of that orientation, Nietzsche wrote extensively about what he called the herd, the mass of people who, consciously or not, organize their lives around the avoidance of difficulty rather than the pursuit of growth, who inherit their values from the culture around them without ever examining whether those values are actually theirs, who mistake comfort for contentment and call the absence of challenge a kind of peace. He was not contemptuous of these people in the way the misreadings of him suggest. He was concerned about them. He saw the herd mentality not as a moral failing, but as a kind of waste, the squandering of human potential on a massive scale, driven by fear dressed up as prudence. The question he was really asking was simple and devastating in equal measure. Are you becoming more of what you are capable of being? Or are you becoming less? Not compared to anyone else, compared to the version of yourself that is possible, the version you catch glimpses of sometimes, in moments of genuine effort, genuine creation, genuine courage, and then allow to recede back into the ordinary. This is where the will to power becomes genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, because most of us, if we are honest with ourselves, know the answer to that question on any given day. We know whether we are moving toward the better version of ourselves or away from it. We know which conversations we have been avoiding, which work we have been putting off, which habits are making us smaller, and which ones would make us larger if we could just maintain them past the first 2 weeks. Nietzsche is not interested in excusing any of this. He is not interested in the perfectly understandable reasons why growth is difficult and comfort is seductive. He simply refuses to let you call the choice for comfort a neutral one. Every time you choose not to do the hard thing, you are not simply standing still. You are choosing a direction. The will to power, in Nietzsche's framework, is always expressing itself, either toward growth or away from it. There is no neutral position. There is no resting place where you are neither becoming more nor becoming less. You are always moving. The only question is which way. Nietzsche admired artists above almost any other kind of person, and understanding why illuminates what he meant by the will to power more clearly than any abstract definition can. The artist, the genuine artist, not the person who produces work, but the person who is genuinely in relationship with the act of creation, is engaged in a constant and relentless process of self-overcoming. Every canvas, every page, every composition is an encounter with the limits of what they can currently do. Every finished work represents the overcoming of those limits, and then the next work begins with a new set of limits to overcome. There is no destination in this process, no point at which the artist arrives and the growth stops. The practice is the point, the constant reaching toward something that is not yet within reach, and the gradual, difficult, immensely satisfying process of bringing it within reach is the expression of will to power in its most visible and most admirable form. But Nietzsche was not saying that only artists have access to this. He was saying that the artist's relationship to their craft is a model for how any human being can relate to any domain of their life that genuinely matters to them. The parent who keeps showing up with patience and presence even when it is exhausting. The athlete who pushes past the point where their body wants to stop. The person who returns, day after day, to the practice of being kinder than they feel like being. The entrepreneur who keeps building after the first failure. The student who goes back to the difficult text a third time because they know there is something in it they have not yet reached. All of these are expressions of the same fundamental drive, All of them are the will to power in action. There is something important to say about the role of suffering in Nietzsche's framework. Because his philosophy does not ask you to avoid difficulty, it asks you to do almost the opposite. One of his most quoted lines, usually extracted from context and deployed as a motivational poster, is that what does not kill us makes us stronger. The full weight of what he meant by this is rarely acknowledged. He was not simply saying that surviving hardship is good for you. He was saying something more specific and more demanding, that the suffering which comes from genuine effort, from pushing yourself toward growth, from encountering the resistance that always accompanies genuine challenge, is not a cost to be minimized. It is part of the process. It is, in a very specific sense, the point. The difficulty is not separate from the growth. It is the mechanism of it. A life arranged entirely around the avoidance of discomfort is, in Nietzsche's view, a life arranged around the avoidance of becoming. It is the most comfortable possible way to remain exactly who you already are, which is to say, it is the most comfortable possible form of stagnation. This is confronting. It is meant to be confronting. Nietzsche was not a comforting philosopher. He was a clarifying one. And the clarity he offered, the insistence that growth requires difficulty, that the avoidance of difficulty is the avoidance of life, that you are always either becoming more or becoming less, is the kind of clarity that sits uncomfortably, and then, if you let it, begins to change the way you make decisions. Which brings us to the second half of what the will to power actually means. Because self-overcoming is only part of it. The other part, the part that Nietzsche considered even more important, is about what you are overcoming toward. Self-overcoming without direction is just restlessness. Pushing yourself past your limits means nothing if you haven't asked what those limits were protecting you from, and what lies on the other side of them. This is where Nietzsche introduces the concept that is perhaps his most famous and most misunderstood, the Übermensch, translated variously as the Superman, the Overman, or simply left in the German because no English word quite captures it. Let us begin, as we did with will to power, by clearing away what it is not. The Übermensch is not a racial category. It is not a biological type. It has nothing to do with physical strength, national origin, or any of the characteristics that Elizabeth's fabrications and subsequent misappropriations attached to the concept. A person of any background, any culture, any circumstances can aspire toward what Nietzsche meant by the Übermensch. That is the entire point. What the Übermensch actually represents is a particular relationship to values, specifically, the creation of values rather than their inheritance. Most people, Nietzsche observed, live by values they did not choose. They were handed a moral framework by their culture, their religion, their family, their social environment, and they accepted it largely without examination. Not because they are stupid or weak, because that is what most people do in most places, in most eras. You absorb the values of your world the way you absorb its language, before you are old enough to question whether you agree with them. The Übermensch is the person who has done something much harder, who has looked at their inherited values with genuinely honest eyes and asked, are these actually mine? Do I believe these things because I have examined them and found them true, or because they were handed to me and I never thought to look for the seams? This examination is not comfortable. Nietzsche never promised comfort. What he promised was that the discomfort of honest self-examination was infinitely preferable to the alternative, living your entire life by values that are not really yours, toward goals you never actually chose, in service of a version of yourself that was assembled by other people's expectations. The person who has done this examination, who has stripped away the inherited, the unexamined, the borrowed, and then rebuilt from what genuinely remains. That is the direction the will to power points. That is what self-overcoming is for. Not to become stronger than other people. To become more fully yourself than you currently are. To close the gap between the life you are living and the life that reflects what you actually value, what you actually believe, what you actually want to build with the time you have. Nietzsche connected this to what he called the death of God, one of his most quoted and most misunderstood declarations. When he wrote that God is dead, he was not making a triumphant atheist statement. He was making an observation about the cultural moment he inhabited, and a warning. For most of Western history, the question of values had an answer built into the structure of society. God provided the moral framework. The church transmitted it. The individual received it. The question of how to live was largely settled before you were old enough to ask it. Nietzsche saw that this framework was collapsing, that the modern world was dismantling the religious certainties that had organized Western life for centuries, and he was not celebratory about it. He was alarmed, because the death of that framework left an enormous question open. If God no longer provides the values, who does? His answer was, you do. You must. There is no alternative. The only question is whether you do it consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of what you are choosing and why, or whether you do it unconsciously, by default, by absorbing whatever the culture around you happens to be offering. The Übermensch is the person who does it consciously, who accepts the full weight of that responsibility and does not flinch from it. This sounds like a heavy burden. It is a heavy burden. Nietzsche was not offering you a lighter life. He was offering you a more honest one. And his argument, stated and restated throughout his work in different forms, was that the honest life, however difficult, is the only one worth having. That a life of comfort built on unexamined assumptions is not actually comfortable in any meaningful sense. It is simply a very quiet form of self-betrayal. Friedrich Nietzsche died in 1900, 10 years after his collapse in Turin, having spent the last decade of his life unable to read or write or think with the clarity that had defined everything that came before. He never knew whether anyone had understood what he was trying to say. He never knew that his ideas would be stolen, distorted, used to justify the ideologies he had attacked, and then, slowly, painfully, over the course of the 20th century, recovered and restored to something closer to what he actually meant. He never knew that people would still be reading him 120 years later, still arguing about him, still finding in his work something that felt urgently relevant to how they were trying to live. What he left behind, underneath the misreadings and the mythology, is a set of questions that do not get easier the longer you sit with them. Are you living by values you chose, or values you inherited? Are you moving toward the better version of yourself, or away from it? Are you doing the difficult thing that the situation genuinely calls for, or the comfortable thing that lets you tell yourself you are doing enough? These are not questions with permanent answers. They require asking again, every day, in every situation where it matters. The will to power is not something you achieve once and then have. It is a direction, a constant orientation toward growth, toward honesty, toward the ongoing project of becoming more fully what you are capable of being. Nietzsche was writing, in the end, about one thing, about what it means to take your own life seriously. Not in the sense of treating it as heavy or burdensome, but in the sense of treating it as genuinely, consequentially yours, as something you are responsible for shaping, rather than something that is happening to you while you wait for conditions to improve. The man who wrote those words did so while his head ached and his eyes burned and his body made every day a negotiation with pain. He did it anyway. Not because he was exceptional in some biological or racial sense, because he had decided that what he had to say mattered and that the difficulty of saying it was not a reason to stop. That is the will to power, not domination, not conquest, not strength over weakness, the decision to keep going toward what matters to you despite everything that makes stopping feel reasonable. Next time on Nocturnal Mind, we go deeper into Nietzsche with perhaps his most radical and most unsettling idea, the eternal recurrence. The thought experiment that asks, if you had to live this exact life, every moment of it, over and over again forever, would you choose to? And what does your answer reveal about how you are actually living right now?